The world is overarmed and peace is underfunded.
I have dedicated my life to persuading other young people to give up their arms.
Aaron Dykes here with a special warning. The gun grabbers of this country and at the United Nations are moving right now to try to do an end run around our Second Amendment. Through the United Nations Arms Trade Treaty, they're attempting to set up international regulations for the trade of small arms and conventional weapons. It is ambitious but achievable, so says Secretary General Ban Ki-moon.
I sincerely hope that the member states will agree to a legally binding treaty regulating this arms trade.
This is a sneak attack on the Second Amendment, just as Obama told the Brady administration he would unleash. This is an attempt to use international regulations to put more bureaucratic red tape and other controls over the United States. Larry Bell warns in his Forbes column that it could enact tougher licensing requirements, create bureaucratic red tape for firearms ownership, could lead to confiscation and the destruction of, quote, unauthorized civilian firearms, could lead to the return of the ban of the trade, sale, and ownership of semi-automatic weapons, and further could give power to the International Gun Registry, which has already been partially set up through the United Nations. Worst, it undermines our overall national sovereignty, ceding even more power to the United Nations, of which we've already given much away, too much. Now, if it is signed, it would have to be ratified by the U.S. Senate. 2/3 of the Senate, and that's a major obstacle, particularly considering that any legislation to control firearms is explicitly unconstitutional. After all, we Americans do have the right to keep and bear arms. It's important to note that a year ago, Senator Jerry Moran of Kansas and 57 other senators signed a letter, sent it to Obama, telling him not to pursue any United Nations treaty that would affect our civilian ownership of firearms. And earlier this year, more than 120 members of the House issued a similar letter to Obama, warning him not to violate our essential Second Amendment rights. But it's the fact that this United Nations treaty will use ambiguous language and easily interpretable language that makes it so dangerous. Number one, the Senate may not recognize the implications it has on domestic firearms ownership because it's worded in international language. And secondly, this treaty may be able to be ramped up over time like so many other international agreements. Just like all other aspects of our sovereignty, international globalists conspiring to change our way of life and create a new system they control have always recognized that a direct frontal assault on the United States Constitution is likely to fail because Americans have been on guard and because at least some in this country remain educated about our founding and about our important way of life. That is the very reason why they've set up the global government systems to do an end run around sovereignty. So many agreements, GATT, the WTO, NAFTA, the SPP, and other international agreements, either bilaterally or multilaterally, binding other countries together, work gradually. They work outside of the constitutional restrictions, but draw in the net around our country and around other free peoples. In reality, it's a double standard, hypocritically allowing the national security shadow operations to continue, spread conflict around the world in the name of achieving global governments and what they have always claimed that the United Nations would be, complete and general disarmament.
The United Nations has always been incompatible with the United States, its Constitution, and its way of life. It was set up to strangle sovereignty and merge nations into the one world government, where, among other things, the right to bear arms is not recognized. The United Nations has always been for complete and general disarmament, not only of nations, but of its peoples.
The atomic age was born.
By 1957, the International Atomic Energy Agency had been formed, and the premise of disarmament was sold to the public on the premise that atomic weapons had become far too dangerous and that it was time to embrace, quote, one world or none.
All men of goodwill earnestly hope that a realistic control of atomic weapons can and will be achieved.
And while the prospect of a nuclear holocaust is certainly chilling, The actual mechanism of disarmament has completely eroded away sovereignty. First at the nation-state level by undermining the right to self-defense and declare war, and has sadly progressed to undermining individual rights, including that to keep and bear arms under the United States Constitution. In 1959 and 1960, the United States took part in the United Nations 10-Nation Committee on Disarmament. It took on issues of international nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. While it wouldn't last, it would lead to the formation, inside the United States, of the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency under the 1961 Arms Control and Disarmament Act. The legislation had been pushed for by the skull and bones globalist John J. McCloy. It too promised not to interfere with, restrict, or prohibit the acquisition, possession, or use of firearms by individuals, and yet it was a long road and a tangled web. By 1963, the United Nations would achieve its partial test ban treaty. By 1968, the United States would fully enter into gun control legislation, passing the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act, and later the Gun Control Act of 1968, modeled by Senator Dodd on Nazi Germany's gun control legislation from 1938. The United Nations would continue its disarmament track, setting up in 1969 the Conference on the Committee on Disarmament, which would later form the more permanent body, the Conference on Disarmament, set up in 1979. In 1972, it would pass a Biological Weapons Convention.
As you know, the genesis of this treaty goes back a long time. For 2 decades, people have been campaigning on this issue.
The United Nations was no longer content simply trying to disarm weapons of mass destruction. By the 80s and 90s, the United Nations began to take on conventional weapons. And in 1990, that included a treaty on conventional armed forces in Europe, followed by the beginnings of a register of conventional arms. Now, by 1993, Bill Clinton had passed the assault weapons ban inside the United States that would last 10 years.
This clip can be extended to include up to 60 to 9 rounds.
The next year, in 1995, Bill Clinton turned towards international gun control. Clinton would speak at the 50th anniversary of the United Nations, using the platform to beat the drums to go after conventional and small arms as well, telling them they should turn their swords into plowshares and hope for world peace.
We must work on conventional weapons, from crime syndicates and drug cartels, each barrier to justice brought down, each sword turned into a plowshare.
That same year, Clinton would urge the United Nations to begin a study on small arms on December 1995. That report would be published 2 years later and would discuss openly in the header the complete and general disarmament of small arms weaponry. From that time forward, the United Nations would pass literally dozens of treaties and agreements, many of them dealing just in Africa, but all of them dealing with small arms, conventional weapons, parts for firearms, and even ammunition. The 2001 South African Development Community Protocol would not only take on so-called illicit trade of firearms, but would begin to curtail small arms ownership as well, creating a legal basis to deal with both legal and illegal firearms in South Africa. And by 2005, there would be an international tracing instrument set up and adopted generally at the United Nations level. From Bill Clinton in the 90s to President Calderon in Mexico in the years 2010 and 2009 to Hillary Clinton and Obama of the current administration, they have all blamed the, quote, illegal flow of weapons south as a tool to try to rein in the Second Amendment and create greater restrictions.
I have never favored all-out ban on handguns.
And just really brainwash people into thinking about guns in a vastly different way.
Try as hard as we can to keep guns away from people who shouldn't have them.
Looking to Fast and Furious, we could see how talking points about stopping the illegal flow of weapons, keeping weapons from getting in the hands of drug cartels and other violent non-state actors plays into the United Nations' larger attempt to rein in guns. Now, The United Nations knows they cannot directly target the United States' domestic ownership of firearms because of the Second Amendment. And so the Fast and Furious documents have shown how the Obama administration, Eric Holder's Attorney General, and other people inside the ATF and related organizations all deliberately put guns into the hands of drug cartels in order to demonize the Second Amendment and put more bureaucratic red tape around arms dealers in the Southwest.
And redeploying 100 personnel to the southwest border in the next 45 days to fortify its Project Gunrunner, which is aimed at disrupting arms trafficking between the United States and Mexico, working with the Mexicans specifically to facilitate gun tracing activity which targets the illegal weapons and their sources in the United States.
We saw that directly with the new policy at the ATF telling the 4 southwestern border states, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, that they would now have to do extra paperwork and report directly to the FBI whenever someone bought more than 2 semi-automatic weapons. Now, here at the present 2012 United Nations Arms Trade Treaty, we further see the Mexican delegation telling the other representatives of the world that the Second Amendment is no excuse for not having, quote, product controls on products traded across borders. That's using international bureaucratic legal lawyer speak to try to attack the Second Amendment covertly. The erosion of our Second Amendment is not going to happen overnight, but it is going to happen incrementally through different agreements over the decades, gradually drawing in the net. That's really what we have to watch out for here. And because the United Nations Treaty will explicitly say it doesn't go after the U.S. and other domestic nations' right to have arms, it will appear as though it's not infringing on that right. But nothing could be further from the truth. We must always be vigilant, always be on guard, and always say no to gun control, because that is submission to slavery. I'm Aaron Dykes for the Infowars Nightly News.